Okay, so you got 5r squared minus 10r minus 10 is 0. Okay, now this one's not going to factor. You can divide them all by 5 and try and factor, but it's not going to factor nicely, which probably means your answers are not going to be nice. So I'm just going to do the quadratic formula. Quadratic formula is the easiest, fastest way to go, unless it's super easy to factor. So your A is going to be 5, your B is a negative 10, and C is a negative 10. Then just plug them into the quadratic formula, and you're off. So x equals negative b, so it's going to be a negative 10, so it's positive 10, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 10 times negative 10, that's 100, minus 4 times a times c, all over 2a, 2 times 5. Okay, now if you do this, minus 4 times 5 times a minus 10, what is that? 4? Oops. 200. 20 times 10. Alright, 200. So it's going to be 10 plus or minus square root of 100 plus 200 divided by 10. And 100 plus 200 is 300. So you've got 10 plus or minus square root of 300 divided by 10. Okay, square root of 300. 300 is 100 times 3, and 100, there's your perfect square. That's 10 times 10. So I got a pair of 10s. I'm taking 10 out and I'm leaving 3 in. So you got to change this to 10 plus or minus 10 square roots of 3 over 10. Okay, now that's it, except for you can divide both of these by 10. The 10, we're going to play with this 10 and this 10. So change this 10, change this 10, change this 10, all to 1s. So 1 plus or minus square root of 3. That is it. So that's some crappy decimal. That's a nasty answer. So the quadratic formula will give you all your nasty answers. Last one. Whoops. Okay, let's do minus 10v minus 10v plus 2v squared plus 2v squared, and you should get 8v squared minus 12v plus 6 is 0. Okay, double check, because as long as you get your ABC right, everything else is just computation. So your A should be 8, your B's got to be a minus 12, your C's going to be 6. Okay, now plug them in the quadratic formula. So x equals negative b, so it's negative 12 plus or minus the square root of b squared. And if you type it in on your calculator, make sure you put b in parentheses, because this needs to be positive, because a negative 12 times a negative 12 is going to be positive 144 minus 4. And if you don't put the negative in parentheses, your calculator is going to give you negative and you're going to get a wrong answer. Minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a. So here we go. I'm going to change this to a positive 12 plus or minus negative 12 squared is 144. So now I got to do a minus 4 times 8 times 6. That should be a minus 192. All divided by 16. Okay, now 144 minus 192 is a minus 48. So here's our next move. I got 12 plus or minus square root of a minus 48, all divided by 16. Okay, now here's a big red flag right here. If you ever have a square root of a negative, that is in imaginary land. So your next move is you got to take that negative out. and it's going to be 12 plus or minus imaginary square root of 48 divided by 16. So that is the definition of an imaginary. It's the square root of a negative. Okay, so now 48. 48, what's inside 48? 48 is 8 times 6. 8 is 4 times 2. 4 is 2 times 2. So that's done, that's done, that's done. 6 is 2 and 3. That's done, that's done. So inside of 48, I'm going to pull out, I got two pairs of 2's. So a pair of 2 comes out, a pair of 2 comes out. So 2 times 2 on the outside is 4. On the inside is 3. And then on the bottom is 16. And there you are. Except for the 12 and the 4 and the 16, they can all be simplified. You can divide each of them by 4. So if you divide the 12 by 4, that's going to change to a 3. If you divide the 4 by 4, that's going to change to a 1. And if you divide the 16 by 4, that's going to change to a 4. So that is your, oh, but there was a negative, or there was a imaginary. So I'll just put, there's your imaginary. It's got to be imaginary. So here was the imaginary out here. I forgot to write it. Okay, now your last is just imaginaries. So simplify all of these imaginary expressions. Okay, you need to take the negative to both of these. So it's going to be 1, subtract 4 imaginaries, subtract 5, plus 5 imaginaries. Okay, so it's just plus and minus. Now, the 1 can only be plus and minus to the other real. These are real. So 1 minus 5. So your real is negative 4. And your imaginaries play together. It's just like terms. So minus 4i and a plus 5i is a plus 1i. So that's it. Okay, number 2, 7 minus I squared is 7 minus I times 7 minus I. So 7 times 7 is 49. 7 times a minus I is just a minus 7i. Minus I times 7 is minus 7i. A minus I times a minus I is a positive I squared. Okay, now the number one thing about imaginaries is this. Square root of a negative is imaginary. But if you have imaginary times imaginary, that is a real negative 1. So I squared is equal to a real negative 1. So now this is 49 minus 14 imaginaries, and this is a minus 1. And the minus 1 will play with the 49. So your final answer is 48 minus 14 imaginaries. Okay, number 3. You need to distribute the negative 7 imaginaries to that, so it's going to be negative 21 imaginaries, and the negative 7 imaginaries to that, so it's going to be a negative 7, and I times I is a negative 1, and then it's plus, you got to times these together, so 8 times a negative 1 is a negative 8, but I times I is a negative 1, so this is a negative 21 imaginaries, that's plus 7, plus 8, and a plus 7 and a plus 8, so it's negative 21 imaginaries plus 15, and they always put the real part first, so it's going to be 15 minus 21 imaginaries. Okay, the fourth one, if you times these two together, 3 times 6i is 18i, and then 4 times 5 is 20, and 4 times a minus 6i is a minus 24i. Okay, now you can combine your imaginaries together. So the real part is 20, and the imaginary part is minus 6 imaginaries. Okay, now, here we go. You can never, ever, ever, in a fraction, you cannot have an imaginary in the denominator. So, you got to get that turned into a real. So you're going to times this fraction by 1, because if you times anything by 1, you're not changing it. And the only way to turn this imaginary into a real is to times it by an imaginary. So times the bottom by an imaginary and times the top by an imaginary. And that's 1. It's a weird 1. So the top is going to be 3 imaginaries, and the bottom, an imaginary times imaginary is a negative, so 2 times a negative 1 is a negative 2. There you go. So the bottom's always got to be real. The top can be imaginary, but the bottom cannot. This one, if you've got a real and an imaginary, the only way to turn all of that into a real, your 1 is going to be the conjugate. So it's going to be 5 minus 2i. So you times the top by 5 minus 2i, times the bottom by 5 minus 2i. So on the top, 3 times 5, that gives me 15. 3 times a minus 2i, so minus 6 imaginaries. Okay, now on the bottom, 5 times 5 is 25. 5 times a minus 2i is a minus 10i. 2i times 5 is a plus 10i. And 2i times a minus 2i. 2 times a minus 2 is a minus 4. But I times I is a minus 1. So I got 25, and that's really a positive 4. So on the bottom I got 29. And a minus 10i and a plus, that's your imaginary 0 out. So there you go. That is your answer. Okay, let's do these square roots. Square roots, first of all, that's a negative. You can't have a square root of a negative, so take that negative out. So it's going to be negative 2 imaginary, square root of 16. And square root of 16 is just 4. So it's negative 2 imaginaries times 4, which is a negative 8 imaginaries. That is your final answer. Square root of a negative 48, take the negative out, so it's imaginary, square root of 48. Now 48, I think we just did a 48. 48 was 8 and 6, 2 and 3, and 8 is 2 and 2 and 2. So a pair of 2 is a pair of 2's. So 4 goes on the outside with your imaginary. Put it in front, 4 imaginary, and on the inside is 3. Okay, now, if I have 27 imaginaries, you got to remember this. An imaginary times an imaginary is a real, and it's a negative 1. So if I have 27 imaginaries, how many of these is it? How many pairs? How many I squareds? So here's the question. I squared 13 times, that's 26 times I to the 1. There's 27 i's. Right here is a weird way to write 27 i's, because 13 pairs is 26. So now every pair is a negative 1. So I've got a negative 1 13 times. So if I've got a negative 1 13 times, negative 1 times negative 1 times, that's an odd amount of times, so it's going to be a negative 1. And a negative 1 times I is a negative I. So this is a negative I. Okay, let's do 28 of them. If I got 28 imaginaries, that is exactly 14 pairs. So 14 pairs is 28. Every pair is a negative 1, so I've got a negative 1 14 times. I've got a negative 1 times itself an even amount of times, so my answer is going to be positive 1. If I've got it 29 times, so I've got a negative 1. No, I've got I 29 times. So how many pairs is that? 14 pairs is 28, but I need 29. There's my 29th. So we figured out this was 1. So 1 times I is just I. I got 30 of them. So that is exactly 15 pairs. And every pair is a negative 1. And a negative 1 times itself 15 times. An odd amount of times is a negative 1. I think